What's up everybody? So in this video we're going to be talking about the respiratory system, okay? This is just like every other system in your body, absolutely crucial and you cannot survive without it. So we're going to see exactly why that is today. So right here, who do we have? We have a very famous guy, okay? Very famous. It doesn't matter if you know him or not, it's just a person. Now, where about do you think is the respiratory system? If you had to point on this guy, where would you point? If you pointed around this area here, you're correct, okay? Your respiratory system is located up here in an area that we call the thorax, okay? Now, if you pointed down here, that's incorrect because this area here is called the abdomen, and the abdomen does not hold the respiratory system. Instead, it holds your digestive system organs, such as your stomach, your intestines, your liver, and all these kinds of things. So this is the abdomen. So what point distinguishes between the thorax and the abdomen? Like, what if I pointed right here? Is this the thorax or is this the abdomen? Okay, so the way you know is that you have to look at the diaphragm, and we'll see exactly what the diaphragm is later. But the diaphragm is part of the respiratory system, and it's a little dome-like muscle located around here. So it's a dome-like muscle, and we'll see it later. Now, anything above that diaphragm is the thorax. Anything below it is the abdomen, okay? So now let's take a look inside Haaland's abdomen and look a little bit more what's going on. So first of all, this is what we see. This is your thorax. We can see a whole bunch of stuff here, and don't worry, we're going to go over the names of it later. Right now, I just want to give you a brief overview on what the heck the point of the respiratory system is in the first place, and then we'll go on to describe a lot about the details. So what do you think the respiratory system does? Well, first of all, we all know that you can inhale air and exhale air, right? Air contains many molecules. One very important molecule is oxygen. Oxygen is inside the air. It's about 20% of the air's content, right? So we want oxygen. Why? Why do we want it? I'm going to show you now. So you're going to inhale it through some mechanism, which we'll talk about later, how your thorax makes the air come in, right? There's a whole mechanism. So just for now, know that, let's say this is oxygen and it comes in and it's going to go into your lungs, okay? When we can't see the lungs right now because it's behind the ribs, but we'll get there just now. So it's going to go into the lungs. Then what? Then it's going to be transferred into your bloodstream. Okay, so let me put this here. Then it's going to be transferred into your bloodstream. So say it's in the lungs now. The lungs will put this oxygen inside your blood so that your blood has a lot of oxygen. Okay? Oxygen. Oxygen is important. Why? Because your cells need oxygen. So we can say that this oxygen will now get transferred to our cells of our body. We're made up of billions of cells, right? And without oxygen, they cannot survive because we need oxygen in respiration. Maybe you haven't learned about respiration yet, but it's a process by which our cells use oxygen to make ATP, right? So your cells will use this oxygen in aerobic respiration to make ATP. ATP is a molecule that is gonna, it's like money. Without money, you cannot do anything in the world. Nothing can happen for you. So it's the same here. Without ATP, cells cannot survive. They cannot make things happen. They cannot grow. They cannot survive. So very important, ATP. Now, as a byproduct, which you'll also learn in aerobic respiration, your cells, in the process of making ATP, right, to survive, they also make carbon dioxide as a byproduct. Now, carbon dioxide, if it builds up inside the cell, it's very bad. It's toxic. So carbon dioxide will leave the cell into the bloodstream, right, and build up there. But also, we don't want carbon dioxide to build up in the bloodstream because that's also very bad. It's also toxic. So what happens is the bloodstream will take it to the lungs, and the lungs will, guess what, remove it out of our body. So we exhale it. So the two very important things that I want you to understand about the respiratory system is that we bring in oxygen because our cells need it to make energy. And in the process of making energy, it makes carbon dioxide as a byproduct. And carbon dioxide, this one, the blue one here, needs to be removed because it's toxic. So the same system will remove the carbon dioxide that brought in oxygen. Okay, so that's basically the big concept that you need to understand. Now, while we're at this image, okay, actually no, we'll do that a bit later when I introduce the names and stuff. So don't worry, if you don't know any names yet, I haven't said them yet, so don't worry. I'm going to try and make this video as clear as possible. I don't want to rush anything. So I just want you to understand this big concept for now. Okay, so now the next big concept we need to know is that we have many systems in our body, right? We have the urinary system, like the system that helps you pee. We have reproductive system, right? We have many systems, and also the cardiovascular system. Now, one big thing you need to understand is that the respiratory system is very dependent on the cardiovascular system, and you'll see what I mean. So here we have another famous guy, obviously a bit bigger than the other guy, and we're going to look under him and see what's going on inside him, because I want to explain something very important about the cardiovascular system. Okay, so here we have a guy's face, right? We have these pipes. So let me just elaborate here. This is a very important concept. You just need to understand this. Okay, so I'm just going to mention some stuff here. We got our lungs, right? These are our lungs. Here are some pipes which carry the oxygen in and the carbon dioxide out, like we just mentioned. And like I said, in between the lungs, we have this organ here. What do you think this is? This is your heart. Your heart. Your heart and all the vessels associated with the heart is called your cardiovascular system, right? We have so many vessels, some that go to your eyebrow, some that go to your pinky toe, your small toe. Like we have vessels going everywhere, and we got the heart that sends blood in those vessels to the rest of your body, right? Now, let's say this happens. Okay, I'm just trying to make this pipe longer. You notice how there's a pipe? I'm just making it a bit longer. So you know how I just mentioned, right? Let's go back to this. I just mentioned how your cells will use up all the oxygen from the blood and will make carbon dioxide as a byproduct, right? In the process of making ATP. So let's say down here, this vessel carries all the blood to our heart from our lower extremities. So let's say our legs. Let's say our legs just did a lot of running and we used all the oxygen inside the blood. And we now put a bunch of carbon dioxide inside the blood. Okay, so here we put a bunch of carbon dioxide in the blood and we have almost no oxygen left, right? Because we just used all of it. Now we're sending the carbon dioxide back into the heart. So here we're going to slice open the heart so you can see what's going on a bit better on the inside of the heart, okay? So look here. So our lower extremities just used that oxygen, made carbon dioxide. Now that's bad because there's no more oxygen left, so we need more oxygen. Our lower extremities will need more oxygen, but right now it doesn't have it. So anyways, we want to get rid of this carbon dioxide. So we send it up to the heart, to the right side of the heart. Right, we're looking at the perspective from this guy. So this side is the right side of this guy, right? So it's the right side of the heart. And it's going to go into it, okay? At the same time, we don't only have lower extremities, we also have upper extremities, right? We have a neck, a head, arms, all that, right? So there's also blood being carried from your upper extremities. So your upper extremities also did some work, and we're sending back the remaining blood, the blood that doesn't have any oxygen anymore, right? We're sending back the waste blood, basically. So these blue vessels are carrying waste blood, as to call it, blood without oxygen. So we're sending it back, and both of these vessels will lead into the heart. The heart will take this blood, which has a lot of carbon dioxide and very low oxygen, and it will send it down into this right ventricle. So we call this part of the heart the right atrium. And again, you'll learn this in its own separate chapter, so I'm just rushing through it. But we have the right atrium, which will pump the blood into the right ventricle, and then the right ventricle will pump it in this blue vessel into this lung, both the left lung and into the right lung, right? Very important. So now we have blood coming into the lungs that have low oxygen and high carbon dioxide. Does that make sense? Okay, so what do we want to do? At the end of the day, we want the lungs to remove the carbon dioxide and bring in oxygen, okay? So at the same time, this guy is not just not breathing, right? He's inhaling, bringing in air so he can survive, right? So he's bringing in a bunch of oxygen, and the oxygen will also be in the lungs. So what's going to happen now is because the oxygen inside the blood is very low here, right? Oxygen will go into that blood. It will travel from the lungs into the blood, trying to increase the amount of oxygen. And at the same time, the carbon dioxide will leave that vessel out of his body. So right now, what we basically try to do is remove all that carbon dioxide that was built up in this vessel and add oxygen to it. Now that vessel that comes out has a lot of oxygen and low carbon dioxide. And that's going to be this little red vessel here. You see it? These two red vessels. They come now with a high amount of oxygen and a low amount of carbon dioxide. And again, this happens from both sides. So bear in mind, this also happened on this side. Again, the carbon dioxide was removed from the blood, the oxygen was added into that blue vessel. Now it becomes a red vessel. The reason why we make it a red vessel is just because when oxygen is present in blood, the blood tends to be very red, okay? And when it's very dark blue, kind of purpley, it means there's low oxygen and more carbon dioxide. So once the carbon dioxide was removed from this blue vessel and oxygen was added, now the vessel will come back having a lot of oxygen, so it's red. So it travels now into the left side of the heart, okay, not the right side. So now we got blood here on the left atrium pumped down into the left ventricle. Now the left ventricle will pump all this freshly oxygenated blood out into this huge vessel here, which we call the aorta. And guess what? This aorta has branches going to your face, your arms, and it even has a big branch, which you can't see so clearly here, going behind the heart, all the way down to the rest of your body, at your legs, your abdomen, all that, okay? So that's the big idea. That's why I wanted to have this slide here, because you need to see how important the cardiovascular system is and how related it is to the respiratory system. The respiratory system is basically just a system that's going to remove carbon dioxide and add oxygen to our vessels, to our blood, okay? So they work together very closely. So that's very important. If you get this concept and how these two work together, then it's very good, okay? If we continue, now this freshly oxygenated blood was sent to the rest of the body, right? Because now it's fresh, it's full, so we can send it now back down to the body where our whole body can use it. So let's say we sent it down to his face, to his legs, and again, now our legs or our face or our arms are going to use this oxygen and take it up and make a bunch of carbon dioxide again, and that blood will be carried back again to the heart. So it's a nice cycle. You see, your body is going to make sure you have enough oxygen and low carbon dioxide through this cycle, okay, so that you can survive and make energy. Okay, that was a big thing. I hope this makes sense. Let's go quickly to some labeling stuff. So we look now again at the thorax, right? The thorax, which contains our respiratory system. Let's label some important stuff. You can try label by yourself. I think that's a good idea. Why not? Just want to make sure I'm doing this right. Okay, here's good. So a couple of things we gotta label. What do you think this thing is up here? It's not that clear, to be honest, in this picture, but it's your mouth and your nose. Okay, you got a mouth and a nose up here, right? You can breathe through your mouth and through your nose, right? Because they both end up connecting to the same pipe. So whether or not you bring oxygen through your mouth or through your nose, so this area here is like inside your nose, you can bring air through here, or you can bring air through your mouth, and they will connect to the same pipe. So it's okay. If you're not bringing it through your mouth, you can still get air in through your nose because they connect to the same pipe. And then it goes down, blah, blah. We'll label this stuff later. We're just labeling the most outer, obvious things now. Okay, here we got now a rib cage, ribs. We got a lot of these, right? You can count them even, okay? You have 12 of them, 12 pairs of ribs. And ribs, guess what they do? They have many important functions, but the very key one is protection, right? Imagine you did not have a rib cage and I punched you in the thorax. Yeah, I would just punch your lungs, man. I would like destroy you, right? So the ribs is very important for protection so that you're not so sensitive or fragile. Now, the sternum is this little bone here, and it is where all these ribs attach to. You see, this the top pair attaches here, the next pair attaches here, next pair attaches here. They all attach to the central bone called the sternum, okay? The sternum. Now, why are some of these like parts of this rib blue? That's because it's cartilage. It's basically like, it's very similar to bone, but it's not bone. It's a little bit more flexible. And that's important because if the whole thing was bone, we know bone is very hard. So if I punched you, your bones would just fracture very quickly. So because it's a little bit flexible, this part here of the ribs, you're not as fragile. When I punch you, it's hard to break because there's some flexibility. Okay, and then we also have, let me move this a little maybe. Okay, these things in between the ribs, what do we call these? We call this intercostal muscles, because another name for ribs is costal or coast. So intercostal is in between the ribs. So we've got these muscles in between the ribs, and they're very important in allowing you to breathe, and we'll talk about them later, okay? So I'm just introducing their names now. Now the last one here is this thing here. I'll bring it out here, get more clear. It's a diaphragm. It's a dome-like muscle. It's a dome-like muscle. You see, it's like a dome. I hope the image is clear enough. It's hard to make this. So it's a dome-like muscle, which again we'll talk about later, but it's very important in breathing, more important than the intercostal muscles. Okay, so I'll just label it for now. And remember how I mentioned before, the way you can separate the thorax from the abdomen is through this thing. So anything under the diaphragm is your abdomen. Anything above this diaphragm is your thorax. Okay, so this is the thorax, underneath it would be the diaphragm. Okay, so these are the key outer layer things that we got to understand. Okay, and like I said, don't worry, we're just going slow. I'm gonna explain the function of the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles later, how they work. For now, we're just trying to get some basic things down slowly so it makes sense. Okay, so let's dive a bit deeper. So let's say by the way, the intercostal muscles have 2 layers. So let me show you. This is layer 1, you see? So see, layer 1 is orientated inward, so the muscles are orientated inwards. And then if you delete that layer, under that layer, there's another layer, okay? Orientating in a slightly different way. So these are 2 layers of muscle called the external intercostal muscle, and then this one here, which is more inner, is called the internal intercostal muscle. So external because it's more outer, and then internal because it's more inner. And they have slightly different functions in respiration, which we'll talk about later. So if we delete these muscles, we delete this rib cage, what do we get to? We get to the actual lungs themselves. So we're going to label them now on the next picture. So here we go. Let's label them. I think okay. Let's see. So what do we actually call this thing here? This whole big thing. This is your lung, right? The lung. The lung has many small parts to it, okay? Which we'll see just now. So we got the lung. There's this thing. What is this thing here? Move it a little bit. Here. I think this is how I was meant to do it. So we got the lung. And remember, when air comes in, it goes through your mouth or your nose into this pipe here, which has a lot of like cartilage on it to keep it strong so it doesn't like fold and stuff so easily. Because imagine if this folded very easy, then you just couldn't breathe. So it's very strong. We call this your trachea. Okay, so the air is going to come through here. Then the air has got a branch. Let me show you here. So if we open up the lungs and we see what it looks like inside the lungs, what do we see? Okay, so I'll leave one and I'll open one. But basically, we can see that this trachea branches into 2 sides. I can open it as well here. Trachea branches into 2 sides. We call these branches bronchi, okay, bronchi. So let me show you. Here, okay. So we can call this a bronchus, okay, a bronchi. A bronchus is 1 bronchus and a bronchi is 2 bronchi, okay? So we got 1 bronchus here. And now, so this trachea branched into bronchi. Then the bronchi will branch into even smaller things called bronchioles. So bronchioles is just branched versions of bronchi. So we got the biggest one, trachea, which branches into bronchi. The bronchi will branch even further into these tiny ones called bronchioles. All right, so that's more detail that you need to know. We got one more thing we got to know. So I hope this is making sense so far. We only have one more complicated, like one more name we got to know, and then we'll go into more of the functions. So here we have the same image, okay? So as I just mentioned, around here, these smaller pipes are what? What are they? They are bronchioles, right? So I'm just going to do it here. So we can pretend this right here, these little pipes here, they're bronchioles, okay? Let me label it just to be clear. Now, the bronchioles eventually lead into these sac-like things, these bubbles. What do we call these bubbles? You can see here, we also have vessels. Remember if we go back to this guy here, we have vessels from the heart. The blue ones have low oxygen and a lot of carbon dioxide. We're going to get rid of all that carbon dioxide and bring in some oxygen. So you can see it's going into the lung. And these vessels will also branch and get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until they're so small that they can be like this small and supply an alveoli. We'll get exactly to what that is, to supply one of these little bubbles. So this image is quite simple because every single one of these bubbles should have a vessel like this. But we can see the blue one, which has low oxygen and high carbon dioxide, comes in and goes to one of these bubbles. These bubbles is where the oxygen will go into the vessel and the carbon dioxide will come out of the vessel, okay? So, and in that way, it becomes red because now it has high high oxygen and low carbon dioxide. Then this vessel will, guess what? It will go back to the heart, right? It will go back to the heart. How? Through this red vessel. And then this red vessel will put it into the left atrium, pump it into the to the left ventricle, and then and pump out of the aorta to the rest of the body that can use it. Okay, so hope this makes a little bit more sense, because now you can kind of see where exactly this process is happening. Because before, I was kind of just showing it like as happening in the lung. Now we know exactly where it's happening, at one of these little sacs. Now we can call, so now I'm going to zoom in, we can call one of these sacs, okay, there's many of them we can see, we can call them an alveoli. Okay, here we have it. Just trying to put it as clear as possible. Okay, can call it an alveoli. So we're basically zooming into one of these little bubbles now. Now, what is going on here? We're going to label it right now. Make it clear. By the way, we have, guess how many of these bubbles we have in our lung? 300 million. 300 million. So that's a whole lot, man. That's a whole lot. So if we look now, maybe just want to do one thing that'll maybe be a bit clearer. It's feeling a little cramped. Okay, here we go. Yeah, it's better. Okay, here we go. So you can see here, what do we see here? We see this little branch. Here's a branch. So this is a bronchiole, right? Remember how bronchiole was a very small branches, these? They lead into one alveoli. So you can see there's the air will basically come through here into this little sac called an alveoli. Okay, the alveoli, look, are made up of these tiny cells. You can see many, many cells. And then a big one, and then many small ones, and then a big one. So we call these cells, they have different names. These small ones, these smaller ones are called type 1 pneumocytes. Pneumo means lung. So we can kind of like think of it as lung cells. Let me put it maybe here. Pneumo means lung and cytes means cells. So these are type 1 lung cells, and they consist of the major amount of the cells. Most of them are type 1. Very few are type 2. So what are type 2? Type 2 are these bigger ones. Every now and then you see them, they're a bit bigger. But they're far more rare. They're far more rare than type 1. And we'll talk about their functions and everything a bit later. Just know there's type 1 pneumocytes, which are the small ones lining most of the alveoli, being like, it's basically like the wall of the alveoli. And then every now and then it's interrupted by a type 2 pneumocyte, which is very important, but I'll elaborate a bit more later. But they basically make this blue, you see this blue slimy layer? They make this blue slimy layer, which is important. We'll talk about that later. Now, okay, so what's this whole thing here? We just talked about the alveoli, but what's this? This is the vessel. Look, right? Remember, there's vessels around each alveoli. Going to the vessel, we're going to have all of this low oxygen, high carbon dioxide, kind of like waste blood. And then they leave the alveoli as high oxygen, low carbon dioxide blood ready to go to the rest of the body. Okay? So for now, we can just label this whole thing as a vessel. So it's basically like a pipe carrying blood, right, to the alveoli. Notice how this vessel is also made up of cells, right? Everything in our body is made up of cells. So this vessel is made up of cells having blood in between them. Okay, cool. Hope this makes sense. So the big idea is, again, I have oxygen coming into our trachea, trachea branch into bronchus, bronchus branch into bronchioles, bronchioles eventually go into these tiny sacs called alveoli. And alveoli are supplied by blood vessels. That's the whole point, because we want the oxygen from the alveoli to go into the blood vessels and the carbon dioxide to leave the blood vessels into the environment, right? Because then the carbon dioxide that comes out of the blood will go in from the alveoli into the bronchioles, into the bronchi, into the trachea, out of the mouth, into the environment, right? That's the basic concept. Now, let's make it more clear, because this was not that clear, to be honest. I'm just trying to outline a little bit. We're going to be now even more clear. So remember, air contains oxygen, right, which we want to come in, but we want to get rid of carbon dioxide. So airflow can go both in and out of a respiratory system, right? Oxygen should ideally come in and carbon dioxide should ideally go out, right? Now, let me label some stuff. The process of bringing air into our lungs and sending air out of our lungs has a very specific name called ventilation. Ventilation, okay? So you going and that's ventilation. You're bringing air in and you're exhaling air. That's ventilation. Now, remember how I said there's a blood supply going to the alveoli, right? Coming from the heart. The heart is sending blood to the alveoli because the blood needs to be oxygenated. It needs to gain oxygen and lose carbon dioxide. So we can say that there's some blood vessels coming from the heart. So again, I can just go back to this picture. We know that the heart is going to send these blue blood vessels because they have high carbon dioxide, low oxygen. They send them to the lungs, specifically the alveoli, right? So here we go. So here comes a vessel. This is a very small branched version of that big vessel because every single alveoli has to get some vessel. So they got to be branched very small. Okay, so here we go. So we got blood coming from the heart. This blood, very important, will have what? Sorry, I'm trying to find it. Okay, this blood here, I'm going to label it here, will have low oxygen, high carbon dioxide. Remember, we want to change this. We want to inverse this. So it comes in and it goes through the alveoli. Now remember, when you bring in air, you're going to have a lot of what? You're going to have a lot of oxygen and low carbon dioxide because it's coming from the environment. The air is mostly oxygen with very little carbon dioxide. So now what do we have here? We have something very, very interesting. We have a concentration gradient. We have in these blood cells here, because remember the blood cells carry our oxygen and carbon dioxide. So these blood cells here have a concentration gradient. We have a low amount of oxygen and a high amount of oxygen. So just by diffusion, you must have learned about diffusion before, the oxygen from in here will diffuse passively through these layers out of the alveoli into the blood vessel, into these blood cells. And at the same time, the carbon dioxide is very, very high in the vessel and very, very low inside the alveoli. So blood, carbon dioxide will passively diffuse, no energy required, into the alveoli. And in doing so, what happens? The blood vessels, the red blood cells, will lose all of their carbon dioxide and gain carbon dioxide, changing color, right? Changing color. So by the time the blood vessels get here, because they come in and they start losing carbon dioxide and start gaining oxygen, right? Because of this diffusion process here, and they will turn out to have what? They should, in theory, by the end, have high oxygen and low carbon dioxide, which is very good because we want it to be high oxygen so that we can send, so that it can go back to the heart. Remember, back to the heart. Why? Because remember, let me show you. So now, if it's oxygenated, it will now go, the blood will be sent back to the heart, but this time red because they have a lot of oxygen and low carbon dioxide. Now the heart can pump it from the left atrium to the left ventricle, out of the aorta to the rest of the body where it can be used to make energy, right? To make ATP, to survive. Okay, so here we go. Let me have a picture, again, just for clarity. So we got oxygen inhaled from the environment, and it's going to be a lot of it. Let's say put 3. Okay, I don't want to put too many. And then inside here, it's very little. There's like 1. There's very few oxygen. There's much more inside here than in this waste blood. So let's just put a few more here. So due to diffusion, they will diffuse into this blood. Slowly they'll diffuse. And at the same time, remember this. There's a lot of carbon dioxide here inside these vessels, this waste product, right? This waste product. But there's very little inside the alveoli. So naturally, all this carbon dioxide will start leaving into here. And overall, eventually, these blood cells will now have a lot of oxygen, right? And very little carbon dioxide, maybe like very few. And in reality, in here then, we should have all the carbon dioxide that left into here, which will now leave into the out of our body, right? So that's very important. So this process of this oxygen going into the blood and carbon dioxide coming out of the blood into the alveoli is called gas exchange, right? So these are two very important terms to discriminate between. We have ventilation and we have gas exchange. Ventilation is the process of bringing air into the lungs and exhaling air, whereas gas exchange is the process that occurs here at the alveoli, the process by which oxygen diffuses down the concentration gradient from a lot of oxygen in the alveoli to a low amount of oxygen inside the blood. And the high amount of carbon dioxide inside the blood will diffuse back into the alveoli to where there's very little carbon dioxide, Then here we can, all this carbon dioxide can be exhaled into the environment where it can leave your mouth, right? So here again, let me make this clear for you. Carbon dioxide, yeah, I'll put it like this. Carbon dioxide, oxygen. Here's an arrow. I just need to put this arrow. So all the blood will get freed of carbon dioxide and oxygen will enter all of these vessels, okay? Well, I actually messed it up. You know what I'm trying to say. Here, that's better. Yeah, so all the carbon dioxide will leave the blood, all the oxygen will go into the blood. Hopefully by the end, we have fresh blood, a lot of oxygen that will go back to the heart and then pump the rest of the body, okay? So this is very important. I hope you understand. This is the most tricky part to understand. And if you can understand this, then you're well off. Okay, so now I'm gonna dive a little bit deeper to some small details that you need to be aware of. So again, here we have the alveoli with this vessel, this blood vessel around it, right? The same diagram we just had. And we labeled the alveoli. The alveoli is made up of two cells, type 1 and type 2 pneumocytes. Pneumo meaning lung and cytes meaning cell. There's some key differences that we need to know about between type 1 and type 2, okay? And this can easily come up as like a long question on the exam. So the first thing is this. Type 1 is the majority, okay? Type 2 is the minority. Many more type 1s than type 2s. Secondly, the type 1s are much smaller, okay? Much smaller than type 2s. Type 2 is much larger, okay? Now, type 1 is, what's the use of type 1? The purpose of type 1 is for gas exchange. Remember how we just mentioned gas exchange, the process by which the gases transverse or pass through this membrane, this alveolar membrane, right? In and out. So the purpose of this cell layer is for gas exchange. Gas exchange. Gas will pass to and from this layer, in between this layer, into the bloodstream. Now type 2 doesn't have that function. Type 2 makes surfactant. It makes this thing here, this slimy layer of stuff, okay? Okay, so now you might ask me, what the heck's the purpose of surfactant? Good question, it's very important. So you know how we can basically think of an alveoli as like a little balloon, right? Like a little balloon. When you deflate a balloon, what happens? It gets smaller and smaller and smaller until it has like no air in it, right? We do not want that to happen to our alveoli. Even though our alveoli are like little balloons getting air in and then releasing air, right? We do not want them to shrink like this. We don't want them to get extremely small like this. Maybe we're okay with them shrinking a little bit like this one, but they cannot get very small like this. So what prevents the alveoli from getting very small like that? This surfactant. What it does is it does something called reducing surface tension. So what that means is it basically prevents these two sides. So let's say there's this side of the alveoli and there's that side of the alveoli. It prevents these two sides from sticking to each other. It's basically a nice separator. It separates these membranes so that it stays open, kind of like this balloon here. So surfactant is very good at reducing surface tension, which ultimately prevents the alveoli from looking like this, okay? It's very bad to look like this for one main reason, because if the alveoli get this small, what happens is they're very hard to open again. So when you inhale air, it's very hard for the air to go into the alveoli because it's collapsed. It's very small. So now air has to get pushed so hard to open up the alveoli again. Whereas if it's kind of open like this mostly, then air goes in and out very freely, no effort required. Okay, so that's why surfactant is really important. Basically, reducing surface tension, preventing the alveolar sides from sticking to each other and collapsing into this kind of thing. Okay, very important. Lastly, one more thing, is type 1 cells cannot divide. They cannot do mitosis. You know, mitosis is cell division, making two cells from one cell. So, okay, so how does the alveoli then like survive? Like if they cannot divide to make new cells, when the old ones die, then how do they survive? That's a good point. So type 1 cannot divide, but type 2 can. So type 2 is kind of like a stem cell because it can divide and become type 1 cells. So when the type 1 cells die, type 2 can divide and make a type 1 cell, and therefore the alveoli will ultimately survive, okay? So that's it. That's like the key differences between type 1 and type 2. If you can know these four, That's all you need to know, man. If you understand it, that's perfect. Now, we need to know, this comes up often, you need to know 3 small features of alveoli, and you kind of know these already, so I'm just going to say them and in an official list, but to be honest, you already know them. So let's look at them. First one is this. It has thin walls, right? Of course, you know this already. We have, the alveoli is only 1 layer of cells. Imagine if alveoli had 10 layers of cells. Imagine how long it would take for the oxygen to go into the blood and the carbon dioxide to come out of the blood. It would take ages. So a very important thing about alveoli is that they have thin walls. They in fact only have 1 layer of cells, so it's very thin. It's perfect. It's perfect for gas exchange. Otherwise it would take way too long. So that's very important. Another thing is this. Blood supply. Imagine our alveoli did not have blood supply. All the oxygen that comes in would have no place to go. So it's very important that the blood supply from the heart can branch and make all these small vessels that can supply and pick up the oxygen and get rid of the carbon dioxide at the alveoli. So the blood supply is absolutely crucial. Without this blood supply, it would be the respiratory system would be useless. And that's exactly why I said that the respiratory system and the cardiovascular system work very closely together. They are hand in hand. They're best homies. Okay, so that's very important. So again, but that was kind of obvious too. So I'm making this list because it's in a book. Okay, and they want you to know these 3 things, but you already know it. The last one is a bit trickier. Surface area. Okay, so you know this big bag here. Let's say your lungs was a big bag. It didn't have any alveoli. Let's say there was no alveoli. It was just one big bag. And when air comes in, so let's say air comes into this bag from the outside, and it goes into this bag. Now there's a whole lot of air in here, whole lot of oxygen. But think about how far this oxygen has to travel to get to a membrane, Because let's say there's a vessel, it had to get to this membrane and then pass through the membrane into the vessel. So imagine you have so much air here and they have to travel so far before they get to a membrane, before they can get into your vessels. Okay, so this concept here has a very low surface area. There's a very low amount of surface of this bag for air to go to and travel through. So if we do the math, if our lungs were like this, we would get this. If we calculate the surface area of this bag, it would be 9,600 centimeters squared, okay? So that's how much it is. Now, in reality, our lungs are not like this. It's not one big bag, right? We have many branches and many little sacs of alveoli. If we were to calculate the amount of surface area, like calculate the surface area of each alveoli and add them together, it would be way bigger than this number here. It would be 1.3 million centimeters squared. So much more, which means every time we inhale, there's so much alveoli, so much the oxygen immediately comes into contact with a surface and therefore can immediately pass into the bloodstream. It doesn't have to travel like 30 centimeters before it can get to a wall and then pass into the bloodstream. It goes in and there's always a surface area somewhere. So it's instantly in a surface, instantly at a wall, and it can therefore pass into the bloodstream quickly. So this is very important for sufficiency, very important for the diffusion or the blood to get blood supply, for the blood to get oxygen very quickly. So thin walls is very good for diffusion, for quick diffusion. Blood supply is very important so that the oxygen can be picked up from the lungs and dropped off the carbon dioxide. And surface area is very, very important for efficiency. If we had a surface area, if our lungs were like this, gas exchange would take forever. It would take forever for the oxygen to move to this membrane into the blood, and forever for the carbon dioxide to go through this membrane into here and out of your body. This way of having so much surface area because of the alveoli is much, much better. If we were to take this bag and open it up and put it on the floor, it would take up a very small area, right? If we had to take each of our alveoli, open them up and put them on the floor, it would take up the size of a tennis court. Way more than this bag would, right? So it's very important to understand this idea of surface area. It's very important and making our lungs very efficient. So our lungs is not a bag. It's like this. Okay, almost there. Now the easy part, in my opinion. How do we breathe? Because I just said air comes in, air goes out. Okay, man, how? How exactly? Through 2 very important muscles. Your diaphragm, which we know is this guy here, and your intercostal muscles. Between your ribs, costal muscles. And we have 2 of them, remember? We have the external, which is the outer one. Look right now, look carefully. External intercostal muscles, the most outer layer. Then we have inside that, internal intercostal muscles. We delete that. then we have lungs, okay? So now let's talk about how these two muscles actually work in making breathing happen. We also have abdominal muscles, but they don't really do nearly as important of a job as the diaphragm and the intercostal muscle. So I will mention it at the end, but it's pretty much useless. Like, it pretty much doesn't do much unless you are extremely tired, okay? And we'll come over this word antagonizing a bit later, okay? I'm just writing it down so I don't forget to come back to it. Okay, so first thing, diaphragm. So I removed everything else, we just have the diaphragm. So how does the diaphragm help with breathing? Okay, so remember the diaphragm is a dome. When it contracts, it becomes flat, so kind of like this. So a diaphragm initially is like this shape. If it contracts, it becomes flat, okay? So what can you imagine? So let's delete this diaphragm. I'm gonna keep this simple version. So a diaphragm's like this. If it contracts, it becomes flat. So let's say this one here, diaphragm, contracts and it becomes flat. What do we have now? A lot of space. So now, when the diaphragm contracts, these lungs are able to expand, take in more air, take up this space. Do you see what I mean? They can literally expand and now fill up more space. Hence, air comes in. So, let me write this. When your diaphragm contracts, it becomes flat. This creates more space, allowing the lungs to inflate. How precisely does this work? So, when you create more space in your thorax, let me change this. When you create more space in your thorax by making this space, that reduces pressure because now there's more space with less in it. So low pressure, we know things like to go from high pressure to low pressure. So when your diaphragm contracts and becomes flat, the pressure inside your thoracic cavity is very low, which means air from the outside environment is high pressure. So air will go from high pressure to low pressure. So the air will come in and fill up the lungs until the pressure is equal to the outside. And that happens when the lung is full, like this, okay? Now the reverse thing happens. So once your diaphragm relaxes, what happens? When the diaphragm relaxes, it becomes like this again, forcing the lungs to go upwards, kind of squeezing in a way that's like squeezing out the air. You know what I mean? It's going to squeeze out the air from the lungs. How does it do that? It creates a lot of pressure. When the diaphragm relaxes, it creates a lot of pressure in the thoracic cavity, forcing the air to go from high pressure inside here to low pressure outside. Okay, so we can write it in words here. It will relax, become a dome-like, deflating the lungs. Okay, so that's important. So in conclusion, during inspiration, when you breathe in, when you breathe air in, your diaphragm will become flat. It will contract, become flat, create less pressure. Pressure will go from the high pressure in here, go in here, inflating the lungs to make them bigger. Okay, so you're inflating the lungs. When the diaphragm relaxes, it becomes a dome again, creating a lot of pressure, squeezing the lungs, and forcing the air to go from high pressure in the lungs to low pressure outside. Done and dusted. Next one, intercostal muscles. This one is trickier to understand, but I made a great picture which I think will really help with this. So again, there's two muscles, external intercostal, internal intercostal. External is the most outer, internal is the most inner layer. So what happens is this. If we pretend, notice this. Here we have a guy, a skeleton. Look how the ribs actually angle downwards. You notice that, right? So your rib cage isn't flat. It's angling down. The ribs angle downwards. There's a small slope, right? This is very important. So it slopes downward. So your external intercostal muscles attach like this, kind of like putting your hands into your pocket from the top down. So when you put your hands into your pocket, you go from the back forward, right? So it's the same thing with these muscles. They attach from kind of like the top downward, down and forward, you see? It's like this. They attach here and there. And then we have a bunch of them, right? We have a lot of them. So they kind of all attach like this. I'll just put a bunch. Okay. I'll put maybe one more. Okay. So if you pretend you pull on this rope, so you pull on it, what's going to happen to this rib cage? If this muscle contracts, what's going to happen? This is going to happen. So here we have the spine. Here we have the ribs, right? And we have a certain distance. So between the sternum and the back, there's a certain distance that the lungs can fit in. Now, when these external intercostal muscles pull, so let's pretend they pull. So now it's pulling. Oh, it's pulling, it's pulling, it's pulling, it's pulling, it's trying to pull. And let's say this one starts pulling. This next one, it's pulling, pulling, it's pulling on the rib, it's pulling, trying to pull it up. It's trying to pull up the rib, it's trying to pull up the rib. Like it's pulling, right? So we're pulling up the rib. So what happens? The ribs will start going upwards. When it starts going upwards, can you imagine? Can you imagine if this whole thing starts going up? What happens? The distance from the spine to the sternum will increase. So instead of having only a certain amount of distance now that it moved up, we have this extra distance. So we created more space inside the thoracic cavity. So that's the same thing as that's happening with the diaphragm, except the diaphragm does it downwards. So the diaphragm creates space downwards. It creates vertical space, right, to increase the capacity of the lungs. Whereas this one creates anterior space. It creates a little bit of space here in the front so that the lungs can occupy more space in the forward. It has more room for air forward, right? So that's how that one works. I can write it here for you. So when the external intermuscles contract, so they pull on the rib upwards, then they raise the ribs. They raise the ribs. By raising the ribs, we cause more space here, which allows you to inhale, to bring in more air because of the pressure difference. Now at the same time, when they relax, what's going to happen? When they relax, the ribs will drop. So the opposite thing will happen and you will exhale. Now, what about the internal intercostal muscles? So I'm going to leave these here, just so you can see what happens with the internal intercostal muscles. Now the internal intercostal muscles do the exact opposite. So if we pretend, here we have an internal intercostal muscle, they attach the opposite direction. So these attach from top downwards at an angle. This one attach from the bottom upwards at an angle. So if we put a bunch of these, like this, what do you imagine is going to happen? So when they contract, so let's say, now it's going to pull. Oh, it pulls down. It's going to pull down the rib cage, right? It's going to pull down on it. So what's it going to do? It's going to do the exact opposite of this one. Instead, the ribs, instead of being like this, it will be brought downwards. It will be brought downwards, making this area even smaller. So it's doing the exact opposite thing of external intercostal muscles. By bringing the ribs downwards, we decrease this distance, meaning the lung has less space. So you're kind of squeezing the lungs. You're squeezing the air out of the lungs. Okay, so here in word form, when the internal intercostal muscles contract, we will depress the ribs, bring it downward, therefore increasing the pressure inside the thoracic cavity. Now the pressure is higher inside the thoracic cavity, lower in the outside, so the air will go out by diffusion. On the contrary, if you relax, the ribs will raise, less pressure inside the thoracic cavity, so higher pressure outside, lower pressure inside. The air will flow in passively into the lungs, causing inhalation. So that's very important. So to summarize the whole breathing process, basically during inhalation, when you inhale, what happens is your diaphragm will what? Will contract, and your external intercostal muscle will contract. On the contrary, during exhalation, your diaphragm will relax and your internal intercostal muscle will contract. Okay, so now the key thing I want you to remember, so this is straightforward, I think, if you understand this image. Now, the key thing I want you to understand is the diaphragm is the most important one. The diaphragm is can be controlled without your mind. Okay, you can control your diaphragm. You can decide to breathe faster and faster, but when you sleep, you don't think about breathing. So it's important to know that your diaphragm can be controlled without your help. Okay, it can be controlled without you thinking about it. And the diaphragm is the main muscle. It is in charge for most of your breathing. Whereas the intercostal muscle, these are more accessory. They help you more when you're doing like severe exercise and you need more space inside your lungs to breathe. You need more muscles. So these are more secondary. They're not the main ones. They still use, but they're not the main ones. Now, when muscles have the opposite functions like this, right? So because the external intercostal muscle and the internal intercostal muscle has the opposite function, we call these muscles to be antagonizing muscle groups because they antagonize each other. They're doing the exact opposite thing of each other. It's like when your brother or sister annoys you. They're antagonizing you. They're doing the exact opposite of what you want them to do. So when these muscles, the external and internal intercostal muscles, work, they are antagonizing muscle groups. They do the opposite thing. It's the same with the diaphragm and the abdominal muscle. So when we go back to here, I mean, if you imagine you have abs right here in your abdomen. When your abs contract, you kind of squeeze your diaphragm upwards, right, to force air out. Whereas your diaphragm contracts, you squeeze your abs downward so that you can bring in air. So both the diaphragm and the abdomen are also antagonizing muscles in respiration. But again, the abdominal muscles are not that important. So if you can understand the key functions of the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles, know that the diaphragm is the main one and how it works, and this is more of a secondary assisting one, then that's great. Now, because this video will be way too long if I continue, I'm going to make a separate video on one disease that you need to know called emphysema. Okay, it's a disease of, because we just learned about this whole system called the respiratory system, right? And everything about it, but we need to know one disease, okay? And I'll make a whole separate video on this one. Hopefully it will make sense now that you understand the respiratory system. Lastly, here's one question. I know this is not a question that covers everything we talked about, but I'm just giving you a sample exam question. This one is explain the mechanism of ventilation in humans. And then you can see you need 7 marks for this question. So you just need to mention 7 of these things and you can get all the marks. So you don't even have to mention everything. Just mention 7 of these and you can get the marks. So that's it for this video. I hope it made sense. I'm check out the emphysema video later.